This is my Atari 2600, and this is my iPod. The iPod is the new Atari 2600. That may sound insane because in most respects they could not be more different. For starters, the iPod does not have an awesome wood grain finish or a cool Atari logo, doesn't have these neat little ridges, and the Atari doesn't have a screen. You have to actually hook the thing up to a television to make it work. But they're very similar in the fact that they both have massive collections of affordable video games. Most of the games are short, fast, and fun, and simple and easy to get into. The iPod may be dwarfed by a single Atari 5200 game cartridge, but you can pack thousands of games into it. And many of the games have the spirit of old school classic video games like the ones found on the Atari 2600. Games that were trying new things from smaller publishers and independent developers. Many of the games available for the iPod are like classic games. Here's the iPod Touch next to the Sony PSP and the Nintendo DS. And the prices of the iPod Touch and iPhone vary depending on which model you get. Generally, they're much more expensive than the PSP and the Nintendo DS. In fact, this costs more than both of these combined. However, the games are extremely affordable and start off at 99 cents and may go up to $1 or $2 or more for a couple of the larger titles. You can frequently get free trial versions of the games to test them out, and you download them from iTunes. If it's one thing Apple does well, it's that they provide an excellent user interface. The initial investment and startup cost to buy an iPod Touch is quite high, but then you'll find that you can buy stacks of games for a couple bucks. And that's what makes this thing worthwhile, and that's why I think it's very similar to the Atari 2600, because you can walk into a store with 10 bucks and buy a whole stack of Atari cartridges, just like you can go into iTunes and download a bunch of games for 10 bucks. The iPod Touch is a good bit smaller than the Nintendo DS, and it does not fold up into that handy protective clamshell, so it does feel somewhat delicate. The screen size itself is roughly the same size as the PSP. The Sony PSP has a larger screen, but they're both very similar in terms of quality. It wouldn't be much of a review without pointing out a few negatives about this. For starters, the battery life is terrible. If you're playing games, it'll barely last you 2 or 3 hours on one charge. Now, it recharges quickly through the USB port on a computer, but that being said, this should really last a lot longer than 2 hours. This is the 32 gig model, and some games last longer than others, and obviously if you're just playing music, it'll go a lot longer than that, but that's a serious problem with this, the short battery life. Also, it's very small and thin, and I have little feet on the bottom for filming, but it feels easy to break. And I'm a big fan of cheap cell phones, which is why I do not have the iPhone, because I happened to drop my phone and I've jumped in the ocean with my phone before. This thing is used quite creatively by developers to work well with many games. You can play games by tilting it back and forth, steering like that, looking at the camera in the reflection, or using your fingers on the screen. There's a little button that you push on top of the iPod to turn it on, and then you can slide this thing to unlock it, and there you go. These are all of my apps on the iPod Touch, and you scroll left or right with your finger on the screen. It takes a little while to get used to, but it works really well once you start playing with it. Let's go left and right there. Let's pull up a game. iDracula, one of my favorites. Touch it. Comes right up on screen. There's very short loading times for most of these games as well, so if you're impatient or just trying to play something fast on the go, easy to do. Play the game. I've previously reviewed iDracula, which is one of my favorite games on the iPod, but here in iDracula you can see that they've actually built Robotron-style controls into the gameplay screen itself that you touch with your fingers and move your guy around. So while it's not ideal, it does work quite well, and it's pretty amazing how some of these developers are starting to use this thing. And to get out of a game, you just push the button here, and you're back out of it. And we can pick something completely different. Let's pick Earth Day, also from publisher Talingo, who's putting out lots of cool games. Many of these games can work by tilting the unit back and forth, or you can use the screen, which I prefer to do. Let's hit play on here. set this game up. There you go. If you're just trying to play a couple quick games on the go, this thing is hard to beat. This is Bubblehead, a game I've previously reviewed, and one that you steer your character by tilting your iPod left and right. Lots of fun. Oh. You can also do your standard handheld PDA iPod kind of stuff on here, like set it up to check your email, look at the weather, there's maps, you can look at your stocks, it has a calculator, and there's a YouTube app that works quite well. It's not perfect, but it's one of the better ones I've seen out there. Let's look for Classic Game Room. Oops, keyboard takes a bit to get used to. Dracula. Search. And there it is. Click on it. And we can watch a Classic Game Room review together. The video quality on the YouTube videos is actually quite good. Hey, I know that voice. Wait, there's two thumbs on screen at once. And just like Atari games, there's some real winners out there like Star Voyager and Galaxian, but there's also some real duds. So you have to search through a lot of the games to find ones that you like to play, but as I mentioned, many of them have free trials. You can read reviews on iTunes, and you can watch Classic Game Room reviews where I cover these things, and they're very affordable, and many of them are fun to play, so don't count the iPod out. I think it has a long gaming future ahead of it. And it's got a lightsaber application, which is pretty cool too. One other negative about the iPod is it does not have the wow factor of the Atari 5200. When you pull this thing out on the bus, people are impressed. The iPod is just so tiny. But what if I want to play Atari 5200 on my iPod? Is there an app for that? If there isn't, there should be.